Hey everyone, this is Aria. Welcome back to my channel. This is a very exciting week. The channel finally reached 10,000 subscribers, and not only that, it's already passed 11,000, which is so amazing. So thank you to everybody who is supporting me. Also, I decided to finally upgrade my microphone, so hopefully things will be sounding a little bit better for the tutorials. Make sure to like and subscribe, and also if you can, head over to my Patreon page and support me with a donation. Okay, let's create this particle simulation. So the first thing we need to do is open up a new scene, and let's just select and delete everything. Next, we'll hit Shift A, Mesh, and we're going to click UV Sphere. Right click and Shade Smooth. Next, we're going to add a couple of modifiers, so just over on the right, let's click the Modifiers tab. Click here, and the first thing we're going to add is a Solidify, and set the thickness to 0.02. If I turn on the X-ray toggle, you can see that there is an extra edge inside now, which represents the thickness. And the main reason we're adding this is because normally glass has a thickness to it, which also affects the refraction of the light, so this is going to make it look a little bit more realistic. Then we can click here and let's add a subdivision surface, and we can set that to 1. Then while we have the sphere selected, let's head over to the physics properties and click collision. Leave this to default, and this will just contain our particles once we add them. So the next thing we need to do is add our emitter. So the way we're going to do that is just duplicate our spheres. So hold Shift, hit D, and then you can either just click or hit Escape. Since this is just going to be our emitter, we want to remove all the things we just added to the original spheres. So click here to remove the collision. Then back to the modifier properties, and we can just remove both of these. Now we've just got our basic sphere, we're just going to scale this down, so I'm going to hit N just to bring up the transform settings. Click and drag to select all of our scale options and type in 0.92. And now we can move on to adding particles. So just over on the right, let's click the particle properties, and then click the plus to add a new particle system. Now, depending on your system, you can fluctuate a little bit with this number. If you're on a laptop, you're going to want to go to something like 50,000. Then for a mid-level system, go somewhere around 80. And if you've got something a little bit more powerful, you can set this all the way up to 125,000, which was about what my final simulation was. I did 500 frames, so I had double this amount, which also was a little bit slower because I did create the lifetime to last the entire animation, so eventually I did have 250,000 particles in my scene. Just keep that in mind that as you go through the simulation, it is going to take longer to calculate just because we are keeping the particles in the entire time for this simulation. I'm going to set mine to 100,000 just for a little bit of speed. Then, like I said, let's set the start and end frame to match our animation length. And as well, we're going to set our lifetime to 250. Open up the source, and this isn't super important, but we're just going to change this to random just so that we get a little bit more of a random dispersion. Scroll down a little bit further, and we're just going to add some rotation. Again, this can just be a random rotation, which if you have followed my other particle tutorials will just help us to get some nice reflections with the light. Scroll down a little bit further, and we're going to leave this to Newtonian, but we're going to add some motion. So let's type in 10 for the Brownian, 1 for the drag, and 1 for the damp as well. Moving on, we can now go to the render tab here. So this is where we pick what we're going to connect to our particle. So let's click here and go to Object. Then we're going to change the scale to 0.008 and 0.5 for the random. We are going to hide the emitter, so the best thing to do is just name this up here. Just so that we're not getting confused, we can also name this one glass. And now if we ever need to find our emitter and it's hidden in our viewport, you can just select here. Head back down. And now we need to actually create an object to instance. So just something super simple, Shift A, Mesh, Icosphere. Then we want to have a little less subdivisions, so just click this menu and set the subdivisions to 1. Now that we've got our particle, we can just bring this out of the way. So G to move, Z, and I'm just going to bring mine down. You can bring it anywhere in the scene you want. I just bring it down because usually there's some kind of ground plane. Select our emitter, head all the way back down, Then for the object that we want to instance, we're just going to click here and click icosphere. Let's also rename that particle. Select our emitter, back down. Just a couple more things with this particle system, so we'll open up the viewport display, uncheck show emitter just so that we don't have our icosphere showing and it's just our particles. Finally, we want to set our gravity to 0. And now is a good time to save. Then head back to frame 1, and if you hit play, you can see that we've just got our particles inside our sphere. We're just going to add our center object, which will also act as a collision object. So Shift A, Mesh, and then we'll click Icosphere. This time we'll set the subdivisions back to 2. Hit S to scale and type in 0.25. Next, head over to the Modifiers tab here, click, and we can add a subdivision surface of 2. Right-click and Shade Smooth. Then we want to add a collision to this, so into the Physics Properties, click Collision, and because we want our particles to stick to our object, let's add some damping and friction, so we can set those both to 1. So let's just quickly add some animation to that. So again, make sure you're on frame 1, select the icosphere, let's rename this to Center, then right-click and insert a keyframe for the rotation values. And now if I was to go to the final frame, there would be a huge amount of lag. So what we can do is just head up here to the restriction toggles, and we'll add these 2 toggles here. Then for the emitter, we can just click this one in the center. And what this will do is we've got no calculation of our particles, so we'll be able to move around a little bit quicker. So my suggestion is to turn this off for now. Head to the final frame in the animation. I'm just going to set these to roughly what I had my value set to, which was about there. Right-click and insert a new keyframe. Hover over the timeline, hit T, and select Linear. And basically what that's doing, if I quickly jump into the graph editor, click Normalize, is you can see now that instead of having a gradual start and end, we have an even motion throughout. If I just quickly throw on the wireframe, you can see now that our center is spinning. The next thing we want to do is hit Shift A, Force Field, and we're going to go to Turbulence. The turbulence will just help our particles get some nice noisy motion to them. Let's set the strength to 250, the size to 0.5, and the flow to 5. And the size, of course, is just the size of our noise. This is obviously of how strong our turbulence will be. And the flow just helps to slow things down, and it also tends to bring the particles a little bit more in uniform. We do want to add a couple more things, so let's just go down to the bottom here. We're going to add a minimum and maximum distance, and basically this is just the fall off for our force effect, so it won't really affect anything outside of this range here. So we'll set the minimum to 0.6 and the maximum to 2. So basically you'll have our main effects here and it'll sort of just fall off. Then now that we have that, we do want to add some extra motion to our turbulence force just so that we don't have too much of a static motion with our particles. Make sure that you're on frame 1. Then we'll add keyframes to our location by hovering over this and hitting the I key, and as well as the rotation. So hover over this and hit I. You can also hover in the 3D viewport, hit I, and select location and rotation as well. Then I'm just going to head all the way to the end again and just set our values again, so something like that, and insert a keyframe. You'll notice that I am always adding one negative value. That's just because I found it rotates a little bit more uniform if you've got one of these set to a negative value. Then back to frame 1. And now we need to add some noise to our location, so let's head up to the left. When you see a little plus symbol, click and drag to add a new window. Click here and we're going to go into the graph editor. Make sure to hit Normalize if you haven't already, just to bring everything into focus. Then we can open this up. Now we're going to work with our location values, so let's hover in here, hit N. Then open the modifiers. We have our X location selected, so let's click here and add a noise. Then we're going to set this to 11.5 and the strength to 0.5. We want to do this for all of our locations, so let's click here so we can copy our modifier. Select the Y location and click here to paste. Then let's just change the phase. Now select the Z and let's do the same thing. Paste and change the phase. Now we're done with this window, so I'm just going to close it. So right click, join, and click over here. I'm going to quickly bring back the particles just to show you where we're at. And now you'll see that we're starting to get some nice curls and stuff, but things are sort of sticking to the outside, so we're going to add a couple more forces. Back to frame 1, and I'm just going to turn this off just so that we've got a snappy viewport. Shift A, force field, and I'm going to click vortex. Set the strength to -6. And for the vortex, basically a negative number will just change the way that it spins, whereas a positive value will spin the other way. Then again, we just want to add a little bit of inflow. Then let's set the power to 2. And we want to add a minimum and maximum distance again. So click here and type in 0.8. And for the maximum, we're going to type in 1.07, which will just sit just outside of our sphere. Then we do want to rotate this as well, like we did with our turbulence. So let's go to the rotation, hover over it and hit I. Then head to the final frame. -125, 150, and 100. Right click and insert a new keyframe. Now I'll just quickly show you what effect we've added so you can see things are getting pulled in closer to the center now. But they're still kind of sticking to the outside, so we're just going to add a couple more forces here. Shift A, force field, and we're going to click magnetic. Set the strength to -2 and the flow to 1. We also want to rotate this as well, so on frame 1, hit I, click rotation, then again all the way to frame 250. So let's just make sure we turn that off. Set this to -75 and the Y to 100, then add a keyframe again. Back to frame 1, and the very last thing I did was just add one more small force, so Shift A, force field, and let's click drag. Set these both to 2. Now that we've got that finished, we can head back up to our emitter and turn this back on. I'm just going to turn off my overlays and hit play, and you can see that we've got really nice motion now, so everything is looking really good. I'm just going to head back to frame 1 like I always do. Select the emitter and we can head over to the particles. Now that we've got everything complete, we can bake our simulation, so I'm just going to turn mine up a little bit just so there's a better visual representation. But like I said, you can go anywhere between 50 and 125. This is more like the maximum. Make sure to save. Then just before we bake this, you'll notice that we're kind of in the center here, so we are going to be building stuff underneath. So we do want to bring this up, but we have to remember that we do have keyframes here. So what we need to do is add a control to move all of this stuff. So Shift A, empty and plane axis. Then just bring this up above. Hit A to select everything else in the scene. Then you can see that this is still our current selection, so if we hold Control P and select Object, everything will now be under this empty. So let's just rename this to All. Then we can just select it, GZ, and just bring this up. Save, and now that we've got that, we can select our emitter one more time, scroll all the way down, and click Bake. So that took about 2 or 3 minutes from my system, so hopefully yours was quick as well. I always like to save as soon as I'm done baking. Then we can just click here to turn the overlays off, and we can just play our animation. Awesome, so things are looking really good. Hopefully yours is looking good as well. Even if you have less particles, you should still get these nice trails like this. It just may not be quite as defined. And that's it for simulation, so now we can move on to finishing our scene. So I'm just going to remove my particles again just so we've got as much speed as possible in the viewport. Let's head over to the shading tab. First thing we want to do is add an HDRI, so I'm going to select here and click World. Then if I just zoom out, you can see that we've got our basic background hooked up to here. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You could just select here and click Environment Texture, which is the easiest way. Or you can also search for environment texture. Then click open, and if you want to use the same HDRI that I'm using, just go to the link in the description and download the 1K version. You don't need these just because we're only using this for lighting. I'm going to use 4K just because that's the one that I have, but again, this will slow down your render, so always do the lowest that you can, then click open. This is going to be a little bit too strong since we're going for a darker look, so we're going to type in 0.01 for the strength. Then, like I said, we don't want to use this as our background, we just want to have a dark background, so we can just select this, Shift D to duplicate, click the color, and we'll just bring this down. We want to mix these together, so Shift A and search for Mix Shader. Click, and then you just want to make sure that this is set up properly, so let's hook this one up to the bottom. And the strength doesn't matter since our value is 0 anyways. Shift A, and we're going to search for Light Path. Then in this case, we want to select our top output and hook it up to the factor. And what this will do is use this as our lighting information and this as our background color. Now we can turn on our render preview, so I'm just going to click here to turn it on, and you can see that we got very basic lighting. And now let's head back over here and go back into the object shading. Then I'm just going to open this here just so that we can see all of our items, and I'm going to select glass. Since this is surrounding everything else, I'm just going to start with this, so let's click new. Then this is going to be super basic, so we're going to bring the roughness almost all the way down to about 0.1. And bring the transmission all the way up. You could do this in Eevee, but I ended up doing my final animation in Cycles. So if you are going to use Eevee, make sure to head over here to the materials properties and add screen space refractions. Also in the render properties, you're going to add screen space reflections and refractions as well. Then you can start to see through, but if you are going to use Eevee, you may want to change the IOR a little bit to something like 1.1 just so that you can see through a little better, otherwise you will get some distortion. Also, the other thing you can do, if you go back to the material properties, scroll all the way down, you can also add some depth, which again will just help your final to look a little bit better. Next, we can add our only other source of light, which is going to be the center here. We're going to click New. Then we want to change this to emission, so the quickest way to do that is in the materials properties. Click here and just select emission. We can change the color just a little bit and set the strength to 250. Again, if you are using Eevee, feel free to add bloom as well, but maybe bring it down just a little bit. And now that we've got some lighting, we can also bring in our background, so let's just go into the render properties in either Eevee or Cycles. Open up film and let's uncheck transparent. At this point, I am going to switch over to Cycles, but feel free, like I said, to follow along in Eevee if that works better for you. You won't get quite the same look, but these settings that I gave you should get you pretty close. So switch to Cycles, and I'm also going to select GPU Compute. As well, I'm going to turn on a couple other settings, so adaptive sampling, and I'm also going to turn on denoise. And I am going to turn the viewport denoising on as well. We want to add in the particles now, so I'm just going to bring my mouse down to the bottom, and when I see this plus, I'm just going to drag up, click here, and add the timeline just so that we can scroll through anywhere to whatever frame you want. Then up on the right, I'm just going to add the render toggles and turn on the emitter. Next, we want to select our particle, click New. This is what it looks like in Eevee. Let's set the metallic to 1 and the roughness to 0. Also, a trick I like to do just to get a little bit more value out of the particles is if you click on the base color, we can add a little bit of color. And then instead of having the value to 1, we can just type in 5, which will brighten up our particles by quite a bit. So switch to Cycles, and now you see that we're getting some of the edges reflecting, and edges that are facing away from the light are a little bit darker, so you get a nice contrast. And things are starting to look really good, so I'm just going to add a ground plane. So I'll go back into flat shading and just turn on the X-ray toggle just so we can see a little bit better. Shift A and select cube. Then this is super basic, so I'm just going to scale it, so SZ and type in 0.1. Then scale it again, so S, Shift Z to log to the X and Y, and type in 2. I added a little bit of subdivision to my ground, so go into edit mode by hitting tab or clicking up here. Then let's add some loop cuts. You could subdivide this, but then you're going to get a lot of subdivisions on these side edges, which is not what we want. So let's just do it with loop cuts. So Control R and click, then hit escape to leave it in the middle. And set this to 25. Come around to the side, Control R one more time, click, then escape, and set this to 25 again. Tab to go back into object mode. Head over to the modifiers properties. Let's click here and we're going to add a wireframe modifier. Then click here one more time and we can add a solidify and set the thickness to 0.03. It is looking a little bit funny, so let's just scale our transform. So select the object, and if I hit N, you can see that our scale is set to what we made it, but we need these to go back to 1. So to reset those, we hold Control A and select all transforms. And that's looking a lot better now. We can just quickly add a material, so select the ground, click New, Metallic to 1, set the roughness to around 0.2 or so, and again we want to set the value to something around 5. Just quickly, I'm going to go back into the render preview just to see how things are looking. Then once you've found that, you can quickly go back into the world properties and you can just select the HDRI, hold Control and hit T to add a mapping and texture coordinate node using the Node Wrangler add-on, or you can just search for them. And then you just want to find whatever angle works the best for you. So for me, it's around 150. Things are looking really good, so I'm just going to quickly add a camera just so we can sort of see where we're at. So Shift A and camera. I'm going to head back to the layout tab just so that there's a little bit more room. Set up my view to something that I like, and then we're just going to hold Control Alt and hit 0 on the numpad to lock the camera to the viewport. Then just hit N and use your location toggles just to straighten things out a little bit. Then we can just add a little bit of depth of field, so head into the camera properties, click depth of field. Let's select a focus object, so the best one for this is our center sphere. Then you can set the f-stop to something around 0.8 or so, and that should work fine. Keep in mind that the lower you set this, the longer render times you're going to get. I'm just going to do a quick render just to see sort of where we're at. For now, I'm just going to set it to around 175. Add some motion blur, and I also added a little bit of extra motion blur to mine just to give it a slightly more streaky look, but again keep in mind that this will add to your render times. Great, so just a quick render just to see where we're at, and things are looking really good. And when I'm using cycles, I typically do that just because it can be difficult sometimes to see where you're at without having a full render, whereas in Eevee it's a little bit easier. I'm just going to scale things just a little bit. Something like that looks a little better, and now we can finish our scene. So I'm just going to get out of the render preview and also turn off my emitter just so things are moving a little quicker. I just added a basic cylinder for my stand. So something like that, and let's just select our outer edge here by holding Alt and selecting this in either vertex or edge select mode. Then hit I to inset, click, and we can just add a few more subdivisions as well. Of course, we don't want this to intersect with our sphere, so we can turn on proportional editing by clicking up here, which will just give us a fall off when we move our vertices. So G, Z, and you can see if I drag down, kind of the whole thing is moving. So there's a couple things we can do. First, let's click here and select connected only. Then hit GZ again, and you can see now it's only the top vertices. We also want to scroll in with our mouse key just so that we're only getting the ones that we really want. Bring this down just so it's somewhere close to that, and then we can Alt select this loop, turn off proportional editing, and just hit GZ just to bring this back up. Then you just want to hit Control R and just add some random loop cuts just to give it some definition. Also add some insets to the bottom face as well. Then when you've got something that you like that's much nicer than that, you can go back into object mode and shade smooth. Something that helps everything look a little bit nicer is in the modifiers tab, click here and add a subdivision of 2. Then you can just hit G and Z just to bring this up so that it's nice and snug. I'm also going to bring the ground up as well. Save, and then we'll just quickly go back into the shading, select our object, click new, and then we can just add something metallic. I added some random texture to mine, so feel free to do that as well. As you're going along, just making small tweaks. So I'm just going to bring the roughness up on the glass to around 0.2, just so that we get a little bit of a glowy reflection. Again, I know this is looking a little bit funny, so at any time you can just go into the camera. And if you want to do a super quick render, you can just bring the sampling down, and you can also just bring the size down as well, which will just help you get a little bit quicker of a render. Awesome, so that's looking pretty good, but like I said, you can make this anything you want, so maybe we can change this a little bit. Really just to whatever works for your scene, so something like that should be fine. And that is almost everything. The only other thing I did was add a base to this and add a character in the background, so I'm just going to quickly do that. And add the same material as I did for the ground. That's looking great, so you can just move your particle further out of the way if you want, just so that it's nowhere in view. Then the very final thing that you noticed with mine is it was a little bit empty in the background, so I added a character. So if you want to do that, just go to mixamo.com and you can sign up for a free account, and this is the character that I chose. But this doesn't really matter, it's really more about the animation, so I went into animation. And if you type in Goalkeeper Idle, you'll see that there's this version here, which is basically what I used. I did modify this because you can see it is moving pretty quick, so bring the overdrive down and bring the arm spacing up to something around 56. Since I used a lot of frames from mine, I also upped this quite a bit, just so that I had more to work with. But you probably only need about 100 frames to be totally honest. Then you can download, set this to 24 frames per second. I prefer to use FBX just because I think it's a little less glitchy. Click download. Then back into Blender, File, Import, and select FBX. Then you just want to select the FBX that you saved and click Import. You can see that it's kind of hidden inside our thing, so let's scale that up. So hit S and type in 20 to make this quite large. We also want to rotate this, so R and Z and type in 90. Then G and Z just to bring this all the way down. GX. Then you can just put this into whatever position you want. Something like that worked for me. You'll see that if I hit play, we do have a lot of motion, and it's a little bit too much, so I did a little bit more tweaking with mine just to get the right keyframes. But a quick way to do this is once you've got all these selected, hit S to scale and type in 10, which will just space our keyframes out quite a bit. And now if you hit play, you can see that it's moving a lot slower. The only other issue that I see is the hand gets really close on this side. So for this animation, I noticed that it sort of comes over to this side and sort of stays over here. So once it gets to this point where it's very close, I'm just going to grab these keyframes and just drag this all the way to frame 1. Then if we go back to frame 1, we can just hit G and Y to move this over again. Click, and now if you hit play, you can see that it sort of just stays centered around this, which is more what we want. And in fact, this actually turned out better than the animation I used, so hopefully that works for you. And that's it. So back into the camera view, and let's go into render preview and turn everything back on. One more thing that I did as well, just to bring this together, is if you click your ground plane, just right click and shade smooth. And for whatever reason, this just seems to look a lot better. So we can head back into the rendering tab. I'm going to crank this back up again, and I'm going to turn my samples back up. Render and render image. And there's the final image, so hopefully yours is looking exactly like this. Like I said, for this, shade smooth on the ground will just lay into the scene a little bit nicer. You'll notice that this was 1:16 for this one frame, so you can imagine that doing 250 frames will take a little bit longer. So some things that you can do is you can take your motion blur down a little bit, which will speed it up. Of course, your samples can be lowered to help speed up the render as well. I also had mine at 150%, so this is a lot bigger than a normal frame would be. If we were to set this to 100, for example, and bring our samples back down to something like 175, as well as setting our motion blur back down, then you'll see, of course, that this has gone significantly faster. We've done this in 26 seconds, and it looks almost just as good. So keep that in mind that if you do have a slower system, there are ways to speed up your simulation. And as well, the final thing that you can do to speed this up is just lower your particle count before you bake. So I hope you all enjoyed this tutorial. Make sure to like and subscribe. As well, if you want to get the original file for my animation, you can head to my Patreon page, sign up to become a member, and you'll get access to my original animation files for everything you see on the channel. Thank you again for your support, and I hope to see you soon. Bye!